morning of April 12, 2017 began without drama in Greystone Bay. The sea was calm, the air cool, the kind of weather fishermen quietly hope for but never count on. At 5:17 a.m., Peter Calloway's trawler, the Marguerite, pushed away from the dock. Neighbors remembered hearing the low hum of her diesel engine echo through the stillness. Peter had been a fixture here his entire life, 46 years old, lean from decades at sea, his skin weathered and freckled from the salt and sun. To the locals, he was steady, reliable, the kind of man who always came home with his catch. That morning, he carried the easy routine of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. A thermos of coffee on the dash, a bait bucket stowed neatly by the starboard side, a promise to be back by nightfall. The Marguerite was small but capable, a 28-foot fiberglass trawler painted white and blue, her name stenciled in fading letters on the hull. She had no crew that day. Peter often preferred working alone. His plan, as far as anyone knew, was to fish the deeper waters about 40 miles offshore, returning before the tide turned against him. At 7:52 a.m., he radioed another fisherman to report his nets were in place and the weather was holding. That would be the last verified communication anyone had with him. By early afternoon, the wind shifted slightly and clouds thickened on the horizon. Nothing unusual for spring. Experienced captains like Peter often navigated through worse without concern. But just after 3:15 p.m., a radio operator at the harbor logged static-heavy chatter believed to be Peter's voice. No clear words could be made out, and repeated attempts to raise him went unanswered. By Faucrejour, the transmission had gone completely silent. Still, in a profession where equipment fails often, most assumed it was just a dead battery or a loose connection. He'd be back before the evening news. Night fell over Greystone Bay without the familiar sight of the Marguerite returning. On shore, the sodium lights along the pier glowed against the dark water, casting reflections that seemed to wait alongside the families of other fishermen. Marie, Peter's wife of 21 years, walked the length of the dock more than once, searching the distance for a single white light on the horizon. It never came. By 10 p.m., she called Jacob, their 19-year-old son, home from a friend's house, telling him only that his father was running late. By midnight, the phrase had changed to, "Something's wrong." At 1:43 a.m., Marie made the call to the Coast Guard. The search began before sunrise. Helicopters swept grids over the water. Rescue boats traced the currents, running parallel lines that expanded by the hour. Pilots scanned for any sign of debris, a life jacket, an oil slick, even a tangle of nets caught in the waves. They covered more than 500 nautical miles in the first 3 days, combing the stretch of ocean Peter was expected to be in and extending far beyond. Each pass turned up nothing, no wreckage, no distress beacon, no sign the boat had ever been there at all. By the 5th day, the tone shifted. Search patterns widened into remote waters, beyond where it was believed Peter could have drifted under power. Satellite imagery from the day he vanished was reviewed, searching for a white and blue silhouette against the deep green of the Atlantic. Analysts flagged one faint shape near the edge of the search zone, but the coordinates led to nothing but open water. The absence of wreckage bothered seasoned rescuers. Boats that size didn't simply vanish without leaving a trace, unless they were pulled under intact or carried away far beyond recovery. With no sign of foul weather strong enough to sink the Marguerite, theories started to fracture. Had Peter suffered a sudden medical emergency? Had he been struck by a rogue wave? Had the boat collided with something and taken on water too quickly for him to respond? Marie kept asking one question no one could answer. If the boat went down, why wasn't there anything left behind? By the 9th day, search crews returned with fewer vessels. By the 12th, the Coast Guard informed the family they were suspending active operations. It was officially classified as a probable lost-at-sea case, the kind that would eventually fade into local lore, one more name added to the list of fishermen who had gone out and never returned. But for Marie and Jacob, the silence was unbearable. Boats sink, men are lost, but a vessel as distinctive as the Marguerite. She should have left a shadow on the water, a life ring on a tide, something. The unanswered questions hardened into quiet resolve. For them, the search wasn't over, and neither of them could have known that 6 years later, That same boat would return, but with someone else at the helm. In the first hours after Peter Calloway's disappearance, the search effort had been urgent, almost frenzied. The Coast Guard launched a coordinated sweep that stretched across hundreds of square miles, their helicopters dragging spotlights over the ocean's surface, while fixed-wing aircraft traced wide arcs overhead. From the ground, Marie watched them come and go from the small airstrip outside Greystone Bay, clinging to the thought that somewhere out there, Peter was floating in a life raft, waiting to be found. Word of his disappearance spread quickly among the fishing community, and within a day, men from neighboring harbors were volunteering their own boats and fuel to help. They all knew Peter's reputation, cautious, skilled, not prone to reckless decisions. To them, it was unthinkable that he could have gone overboard without a single trace. On the third day, the search area expanded into waters that few small trawlers dared to cross. Spotter planes circled at low altitude, their crews scanning for anything out of place, an overturned hull, tangled nets, even a floating cooler. But the sea kept its secrets. Each report of debris turned out to be nothing, a cluster of kelp mistaken for rope, a shadow on the water that disappeared when approached. The Marguerite remained absent, as though it had slipped through some invisible seam and vanished from the map entirely. Marie refused to leave the harbor. She sat in her parked car for hours at a time, eyes fixed on the horizon, sometimes stepping out when she saw a speck in the distance, only to realize it was a gull or another boat entirely. Her son Jacob joined her after work, both of them silently tracking the incoming vessels, hoping one would be towing the Marguerite behind it. On the fifth day, a rumor swept through town that a freighter crew had spotted a small white and blue trawler near the edge of Canadian waters. The report ignited a flicker of hope, but the coordinates turned out to be false. The freighter's captain had mistaken an abandoned buoy for a fishing boat. By the seventh day, the mood among the search teams began to shift. Rescue missions often have a narrow window, and the longer that window stayed open without results, the less likely it became that Peter was still alive. Still, Marie clung to another theory, that he had been picked up by a passing vessel and taken somewhere without the means to contact home. She called every harbor master along the coast, leaving messages and sending photographs of Peter and the Marguerite. A few called back with polite condolences. None had seen him. On day 9, the weather broke. A low-pressure system swept in from the northeast, churning the water into whitecaps and forcing smaller search vessels back to port. The helicopters could still fly, but visibility dropped sharply, and their search patterns had to be scaled back. That night, in a closed-door meeting, the Coast Guard Command discussed shifting the mission from search and rescue to search and recovery. Statistically, the odds of survival after so many days at sea without confirmed sightings were approaching zero. Day 12 began without fanfare, but ended with finality. The Coast Guard captain in charge of the operation drove to Greystone Bay to speak with Marie in person. He explained that they had exhausted every reasonable search pattern, combed more than 500 nautical miles, and received no credible sightings. Without new information, continuing the search would risk lives unnecessarily. The case, he said, would be recorded as a probable lost-at-sea death. The words landed with the dull weight of something rehearsed many times before. Marie listened in silence, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. She understood the logic, but logic had no place in the space where her husband still existed, not as a body lost to the water, but as a man waiting to be found. By the end of that week, the harbor was quiet again. The extra vessels returned to their home ports, the helicopters stopped flying overhead, and the daily rhythm of the town resumed, albeit with an undercurrent of unease. The Marguerite's slip at the dock remained empty, a glaring reminder that some endings were not endings at all, just unanswered questions suspended in time. And while the official reports would file Peter Calloway's name alongside other maritime tragedies, Marie couldn't shake the feeling that the real story had not yet begun. In the months following the end of the official search, the Calloway household became a command center for their own investigation. Marie refused to file the paperwork for Peter's death certificate, insisting that such an act would be a betrayal. Jacob, still just 19 when his father vanished, abandoned his plans to leave for college, convinced he could find answers if he stayed close to the water. Together, they created a map of the coastline that stretched the length of their dining room wall, marking every harbor, every shipping lane, every possible drift pattern calculated from the day the Marguerite went missing. To them, the lack of wreckage wasn't proof of tragedy. It was proof that the story wasn't over. By the summer of 2018, their persistence began to draw in tips from beyond Greystone Bay. Word traveled through fishing communities up and down the coast, and soon they were receiving phone calls from strangers. Some claimed to have seen a bearded man who matched Peter's build refueling a small trawler hundreds of miles to the south. One dock worker swore he'd spoken to him briefly while loading supplies onto a vessel in Norfolk, Virginia. The details were always tantalizing but frustratingly vague. Each time, Marie would press for dates, names, photographs, but by the time she could follow up, the trail was cold. In early 2019, a more startling claim surfaced. A sailor passing through Baja, California, reported spotting a small white and blue trawler anchored offshore. He didn't know the name painted on the hull, but his description of the boat's weathered lines and cabin layout sent Marie's pulse racing. She wired him money to photograph it, but the man never sent the images. When she managed to contact him again, he said the boat had vanished before he could return with a camera. Whether it had moved on under its own power or been towed away, he couldn't say. Each lead unraveled in the same way. Rumors crumbled under scrutiny. Witnesses misremembered. Grainy photos turned out to be of entirely different vessels. Still, Marie and Jacob couldn't stop. They began spending hours combing online forums for lost ship sightings, tracing fishing logs, even contacting long-haul freighter crews to ask if they had seen the Marguerite. A handful responded with sympathy, but none could give them the answer they needed. By 2020, the personal cost of their search was beginning to show. Marie's savings were nearly gone. She sold her engagement ring to pay for a private investigator who had experience with maritime disappearances. He approached the case methodically, interviewing fishermen from Nova Scotia to Key West, cross-referencing vessel registries, and reviewing satellite imagery from private companies. After months of work, his conclusion was blunt. Without recovering the boat itself, everything remained speculation. Boats could be repainted, renamed, gutted for parts, their identities erased in days. Even if the Marguerite was still out there, she could look nothing like the vessel Peter had sailed that April morning. The investigators' words were meant to temper expectations, but for Marie and Jacob, they only deepened the obsession. They felt certain that if they stopped searching, they'd be letting Peter slip away twice, once to the sea and once to memory. The house is filled with boxes of files, photographs, and notebooks scribbled with coordinates. Every time the phone rang, there was a rush of hope, followed by the slow ache of disappointment when the call led nowhere. And though the years were passing, the shoreline remained the same, the harbor unchanged, as if quietly waiting for something to return. Neither of them could imagine that when the Marguerite finally did, it wouldn't be Peter bringing her home. For a time, the name Peter Calloway was spoken often in Greystone Bay, in the hushed conversations between fishermen tying off their lines, in the pauses over coffee at the diner, in the sympathetic glances cast toward Marie when she walked into the grocery store. But as the years edged forward, those conversations thinned. The empty slip where the Marguerite had once been moored was eventually rented to another boat. Peter's photograph, once taped in the harbor master's window, was taken down to make room for new notices. The rhythms of the town closed back over the absence, as if the water itself had absorbed it. By late 2021, Marie could no longer afford to keep the family home. She sold it to a couple from out of town and moved inland, closer to her sister. She told people she needed a fresh start, but privately admitted that waking up each morning within sight of the harbor had begun to feel like a wound that refused to heal. Yet Jacob, now 24, refused to follow. He rented a small apartment above a bait shop on the waterfront and took odd jobs unloading crates for the commercial boats. It was work that paid little, but it kept him close to the docks. Every morning before his shift, he walked the pier alone, scanning the open water, a habit he no longer mentioned to anyone, but couldn't bring himself to break. Over the years, the sea continued to give up fragments of other people's losses. A cracked fiberglass hull from a capsized racing boat came ashore one spring. In winter, a fisherman found a battered orange lifeboat from a freighter that had gone down a decade earlier. Each time something washed in, Jacob went to see it, searching for even the smallest connection to his father's trawler. But nothing ever bore the white and blue paint of the Marguerite, nor anything that could be traced to Peter. It was as if the boat and its captain had been swallowed whole. Friends encouraged Jacob to move on, to take a job in another town, or even try fishing himself, but he stayed anchored to Greystone Bay. He didn't talk much about the years that had passed or the milestones his father had missed. Instead, he kept his life small and watchful. Sometimes, in the early morning fog, he thought he saw the silhouette of a boat that could be the Marguerite, only to watch it dissolve into mist as another vessel emerged. Those moments left him shaken. Not because he'd been fooled, but because they reminded him that hope, no matter how faint, was still there. Marie visited occasionally, but her conversations about Peter grew shorter, her tone more resigned. She didn't stop loving him, but she had learned to survive without the constant pull of his absence. Jacob, however, felt the opposite. The longer the silence stretched, the more it defined him. In a way, not knowing became its own kind of grief. It was no longer just the loss of a person, but the loss of a place to grieve for him. Without a body, without a grave, there was nowhere to leave flowers, nowhere to speak aloud the words left unsaid. By the time the 6th anniversary of Peter's disappearance arrived, Jacob had stopped expecting answers. He still kept his morning vigil at the docks, but it had become less a search and more a ritual, an unspoken acknowledgement of the void that had taken root in his life. Yet beneath the resignation, a question remained, one that neither he nor his mother could silence. If the Marguerite had truly been lost to the sea, why had the water never given her back? And when something finally did return to Greystone Bay, it would come carrying a truth neither of them could have prepared for. On the morning of August 27, 2023, the sea around Greystone Bay lay under a thick blanket of fog, the kind that muffled sound and reduced the horizon to a wall of shifting gray. Just after 6 a.m., the crew of the Morning Tide, a lobster boat returning from an overnight run, noticed a faint silhouette drifting across their bow. At first it looked like an abandoned vessel, low in the water, moving without purpose, its hull barely breaking through the mist, but as they drew closer, the outline sharpened, revealing the familiar lines of a small trawler. The captain reached for the binoculars, scanning the name painted along the stern. Through the distortion of salt haze and distance, the letters emerged slowly, almost unwillingly. Marguerite. It had been 6 years since anyone had spoken that name in connection to a living boat. The crew exchanged glances, their first instinct to assume it was some other vessel that happened to share the name. But the paint scheme was unmistakable. The faded blue stripe along the gunnel, the weather-worn wheelhouse. The radio call to the harbor master was short and disbelieving. "We've got the Marguerite. She's here." Within minutes, the harbor office relayed the sighting to the Coast Guard. As the drifting trawler edged closer to shore, its condition became clearer. The hull was crusted thick with barnacles, algae clung in ragged sheets along the waterline, and the wheelhouse windows were clouded with salt. It looked like it had been at sea for years without proper maintenance, yet the vessel wasn't sinking. From a distance, the picture fit the narrative of a boat lost and carried back by the ocean, except for one detail that made the crew's skin crawl. There was someone standing at the wheel. The figure was motionless, facing forward as if steering, though the boat's engine appeared silent. Even through the fog, it was obvious this was not Peter Calloway. The man's frame was younger, broader in the shoulders, his head covered with a dark knit cap despite the humid morning air. When the lobster crew tried hailing him over the water, he didn't respond, didn't even glance toward them. Instead, he remained fixed on his slow approach toward Greystone Bay. By the time the Coast Guard patrol boat intercepted the Marguerite 2 miles from the harbor, word had already begun to spread through town. Residents emerged from shops and houses along the waterfront, gathering at the edge of the docks. Many had lived in Greystone Bay long enough to remember the day the boat vanished. Seeing her return was like witnessing a ghost break the surface. But the shock deepened when binoculars and telephoto lenses confirmed what the first crew had reported. Peter was not the one bringing her home. Up close, the strangeness of the vessel's condition became even more unsettling. The barnacle growth suggested she'd been adrift for long periods, yet the wheel and rigging showed recent signs of use. Fishing gear hung from the stern, some of it in better condition than the rest of the boat. A length of rope was neatly coiled beside the winch, its fibers still bright against the sun-bleached deck. The name on the hull was the original, no repaint, no alteration, as though whoever had been in possession of the Marguerite had never intended to hide her identity. The man at the wheel complied when ordered to stop, but remained silent as the Coast Guard boarded. Witnesses on shore could only see brief glimpses, an arm, the back of his head, his stillness as officials spoke to him. Whatever answers he might have carried were locked behind a face no one recognized. For Jacob, who had rushed to the dock the moment he heard, the sight was both a jolt of vindication and a deep, new wound. The boat had returned, but without his father aboard, the meaning of her arrival was suddenly darker, more complex. The Marguerite was towed toward the harbor under Coast Guard escort, the crowd parting as she passed. Conversations were hushed, almost reverent, as if people feared the wrong words might spook whatever truth she carried back with her. But beneath the awe ran a sharper undercurrent, a realization that this was not a resolution, but the beginning of a new mystery. Somewhere in the 6 years since she'd last left Greystone Bay, the trawler had crossed an ocean of silence, and now she had returned with someone else steering her home. When the Coast Guard boarded the Marguerite 2 miles offshore, the man at the helm stepped back without resistance. He was in his mid-30s, his skin burned and wind-chapped, his beard grown thick and uneven. The fishing gear he wore was mismatched, as though it had been scavenged, oversized yellow slickers with frayed seams, boots several sizes too large. His eyes flickered toward the approaching officers, but gave away nothing. When asked his name, he said nothing at first, then muttered only that he had found the boat weeks ago and decided to bring it in. Every follow-up question, where he had found it, what course he had taken, whether he had seen anyone else aboard, was met with vague shrugs or a shake of the head. The story he offered was flimsy. He claimed the trawler had been drifting aimlessly when he spotted her, already abandoned, and had simply decided to take her in rather than leave her to sink. He offered no explanation for why he hadn't tried to contact authorities sooner or why he had sailed her to a small, tight-knit harbor where the name Marguerite was known by nearly everyone. His speech carried no obvious accent, and his clothing bore no identifying marks, no vessel name, no fishing company logo. His presence felt deliberately untraceable. Inside the wheelhouse, investigators found a layer of grime that spoke to years at sea, but beneath it, the cabin was eerily preserved. In one corner, a weathered duffel bag held personal items that had belonged to Peter Calloway, a small pocket knife, a laminated family photograph of Marie and Jacob, and a pair of reading glasses with one lens missing. The galley cupboard still held a few rusted tins of food. In the sleeping berth, tucked neatly into a storage cubby, was Peter's fishing logbook, its last entry dated April 12, 2017. The ink had faded, but was still legible, the handwriting steady, ending abruptly with no sign of distress or urgency. Perhaps the most striking discovery was a sealed glass jar of pipe tobacco, the same brand Peter had been known to favor. The label was yellowed with age, the seal unbroken, as though it had sat there untouched for all 6 years since the day he vanished. For Marie, who had been called to the dock once the boat was secured, seeing those objects was like stepping into a room frozen in time. Each item was a confirmation that this was truly Peter's vessel, and yet the man who stood aboard it was a stranger. Forensic technicians began a sweep of the cabin, dusting for prints, bagging the belongings for analysis. They found overlapping traces: Peter's prints on the logbook and tobacco jar, the stranger's on the wheel and galley surfaces, and faint partial prints belonging to no one in any database. It was enough to suggest that at some point, at least one other person had been aboard. The stranger's hands bore small, healed cuts, the kind consistent with handling rough rope, but no other injuries. When pressed on whether anyone had been with him when he found the boat, he avoided the question entirely. To Jacob, standing on the dock and watching the investigation unfold, the man's indifference was infuriating. The Marguerite's return should have brought answers or at least clues to what had happened to his father. Instead, it seemed to deepen the mystery. If this man had truly found the boat adrift, Why did he not seem curious about its history? Why was he unwilling or unable to say where it had been? And if Peter had died at sea, why were his belongings so carefully preserved, as if someone had been keeping them safe? By nightfall, the stranger was escorted off the vessel and taken to a holding facility for questioning. The Marguerite was moved to a secure dock for a full forensic inspection. As the crowd dispersed, a quiet unease settled over the town. 6 years of silence had ended, but in its place came a new set of questions, ones that felt even more impossible to answer. Somewhere between the day Peter vanished and the morning his boat returned, something had happened. And whatever that was, the man now in custody seemed determined to keep it to himself. The Marguerite was moved under heavy guard to a secure section of the Greystone Bay shipyard, a place normally reserved for impounded vessels involved in smuggling or environmental violations. This time, the stakes felt different. For investigators, the trawler wasn't just a recovered boat. It was a crime scene that had been drifting through time. Every surface, every inch of hull might hold an answer to what had happened to Peter Calloway. The first step was a complete forensic workup, and it began before the deck had even dried from the tow. From the outside, the boat told two conflicting stories. The thick layer of barnacles along the hull, some clustered well above the waterline, suggested the vessel had spent years either adrift or moored in open water without proper maintenance. The wheelhouse windows were etched with a cloudy film of salt, and faint lines of marine growth showed where water had repeatedly lapped against the hull at varying heights. But once the inspection moved below deck, the inconsistencies began to surface. The twin diesel engines, though showing light surface corrosion, were in working order. More than that, they had been serviced, belts replaced, filters swapped, and fluids topped off. Whoever had maintained them had done so recently, and with enough skill to keep them running smoothly. Saltwater corrosion patterns on the propeller shafts and rudder told a similar story. The metal bore signs of repeated immersion and exposure, but not in one continuous span. Instead, the wear was irregular, almost layered, as if the boat had been submerged or idle for stretches, then hauled or stored somewhere dry, only to return to the water again. That pattern directly contradicted the idea that the Marguerite had simply been drifting aimlessly for 6 years. Somewhere in that time, she had been under deliberate care. In the galley and sleeping quarters, forensic teams began their search for biological traces. Swabs were taken from door handles, the wheel, and various points along the bunks and storage compartments. The results came back with 3 distinct DNA profiles. One matched Peter Calloway, confirming his physical presence aboard the boat in the past. Another belonged to the unidentified man found at the helm. The third was an unknown profile, neither of the other two, with no match in any state or federal database. The partial samples suggested a person who had spent significant time aboard, skin cells embedded in the grip of a galley knife, traces on the latch of a bait locker, even a hair caught in the seam of a cushion in the wheelhouse. Fingerprint dusting revealed a similar picture. The stranger's prints were found in obvious recent places, the wheel, throttle, and hatch. Peter's older prints were present on the logbook, tobacco jar, and a set of navigational charts. But several clean prints from the unknown third individual turned up in odd spots: the underside of the radio mount, the interior of the engine hatch, and on the lid of a storage crate containing spare nets. These prints were too crisp, too well-defined to be from 6 years earlier, suggesting they were far more recent than Peter's disappearance. The longer the examination went on, the more the official theory shifted. If the boat had been maintained, and if an unknown person had been aboard in recent months or years, then the Marguerite hadn't been lost to the ocean. She'd been somewhere else entirely. Investigators began to suspect that the trawler had changed hands, maybe more than once, possibly as part of an illicit fishing or smuggling operation. Her return to Greystone Bay might not have been accidental at all. When confronted with these findings, the stranger's evasiveness only deepened. He repeated his claim that he had found the boat adrift weeks ago, but refused to provide coordinates. Asked if anyone else had been aboard when he discovered her, he stared at the table in front of him and said nothing. His fingerprints yielded no criminal history, no immigration record, not even a traffic citation. To official databases, he was a ghost, a man without a past. The most disturbing question was also the simplest. Where had the Marguerite been for 6 years? For a boat to have avoided detection that long, especially with an active missing persons file attached to it, it would have to be kept in a remote or private harbor, far from regulated ports. And if Peter had been aboard for any part of that time, willingly or not, then the mystery was no longer just about a lost fisherman. It was about who had controlled his vessel and why they had finally sent her back. By the end of the week, the trawler was stripped of every item that might hold evidence. The hull was scanned for concealed compartments, the bilge water filtered for trace materials, even the anchor chain inspected link by link. Nothing answered the most pressing questions. Instead, the evidence built a narrower, sharper point. The Marguerite's disappearance had not been a simple tragedy at sea. It had been the opening move in a chain of events that someone, somewhere, still wasn't ready to explain. And the man who had steered her back to Greystone Bay was either protecting them or afraid of what would happen if he told the truth. In the weeks following the Marguerite's sudden reappearance, the story spread well beyond Greystone Bay. Newspapers along the coast ran headlines about the ghost boat returning home with a stranger at the helm, and television crews set up near the harbor, eager to film the trawler that had defied 6 years of silence. But inside the town, where Peter Calloway's name still carried weight, the atmosphere was different. The shock had faded into something heavier, a restless need to make sense of what the boat's return really meant. And soon, the theories began to surface. Some whispered over drinks at the dockside bar, others spoken with conviction by men who'd worked the water their entire lives. The first theory came from those who refused to believe Peter had died in 2017. They suggested he had been rescued at sea, perhaps by a foreign vessel, and brought into a world far beyond his choosing. Illegal fishing operations in unregulated waters, the kind run off distant coasts where there was no oversight and no questions asked. To them, the irregular wear on the Marguerite's hull and the fact that her engines had been serviced pointed to one thing: she had been in active use. They imagined Peter working aboard her under duress, the boat changing hands multiple times in a shadow market of unregistered vessels, each new owner sanding away a little more of her original identity until she was no longer a missing American trawler, but just another working boat far from home. Under this theory, the man who brought her back might have been the last in a long chain of keepers, one who no longer needed her, or who wanted her found for reasons no one yet understood. Others, though, saw only foul play in the boat's return. To them, the lack of distress signs back in 2017 had always hinted at something deliberate. Perhaps Peter had been killed on that last voyage, either by someone he knew or by a stranger who boarded him at sea. The Marguerite, still seaworthy, could have been stripped of identifying marks and repurposed for years before being abandoned. The items found intact aboard her, Peter's logbook, his pipe tobacco, the family photo, weren't seen as sentimental remnants, but as trophies someone had chosen to keep aboard, a quiet claim to ownership over the vessel's grim history. If that was true, the boat's reappearance in Greystone Bay wasn't an accident. It was a taunt, a reminder that whoever was responsible had the power to return the evidence to Peter's hometown whenever they wished. Then came the darker, more unnerving rumor, one that spread in low voices and carried the weight of both plausibility and threat. Some locals believed the Marguerite had been used as part of a smuggling route in international waters, not just for contraband, but for human cargo. Remote islands, unpatrolled coasts, and the anonymity of the open ocean made such operations possible. If this was the case, then her return to Greystone Bay could have been intentional, a signal meant for someone still living here. A message wrapped not in words but in the hull of a familiar boat, delivered without explanation. It would mean the man at the helm had never intended to explain himself because the delivery was the explanation, one meant for someone else entirely. Maritime experts weighed in from afar, pointing out that the layered corrosion patterns on her hull and the irregular maintenance of her engines were consistent with a vessel being pulled from the water for long stretches, a practice common in illegal operations that wanted to avoid satellite detection. That, combined with the presence of an unknown third DNA profile, fueled speculation that the Marguerite had been a silent witness to events that might never be fully uncovered. Some of these experts argued that without the cooperation of the man found at the helm, the truth might be locked away forever in the unrecorded movements of the boat. For Marie and Jacob, hearing these theories was both a torment and a lifeline. Each one offered a possible explanation, but each also came with its own version of the truth about Peter. Some where he had died quickly, others where he had lived for years in captivity, and still others where he had been complicit in something unthinkable. None of them felt complete, but none could be dismissed outright. The Marguerite's return had given them a physical piece of him back, but it had also splintered the mystery into a dozen different shapes, each more unsettling than the last. The Coast Guard continued to investigate, tracing possible routes the trawler could have taken based on current patterns and maintenance clues. But the ocean is not a ledger, and its history leaves no clean record. Without cooperation from the man who brought her back, and without knowing who the third DNA profile belonged to, the investigation remained a maze with no clear exit. Still, in the harborside conversations and over late-night coffee in the Callaway kitchen, one question rose above the rest. If the Marguerite had been sent back as a message, then who in Greystone Bay was meant to receive it? And what were they supposed to understand? The answer to that question would determine whether this was the end of the story or the start of something far worse. The logbook was one of the first things investigators revisited after the initial forensic sweep, this time with closer attention to the entries from Peter's final voyage. The leather-bound cover was stiff with salt and age, its pages warped but still intact. Most of the handwriting chronicled routine details: wind speed, water temperature, the quantity and type of fish caught. But on the last page, under the date April 12, 2017, the tone shifted. The first few lines were normal, a note about steady weather and decent yields from the first net pull, but halfway down the page, a single sentence stood apart. It read, "Storm building from the east, a vessel shadowing my course since dawn." There were no coordinates, no vessel description, nothing to indicate whether Peter had tried to make contact or change his route. That was the last line in the book. The pen stroke ended cleanly, as if he had set it down mid-thought and never picked it up again. For Marie and Jacob, the entry felt like a thread, the first tangible suggestion that Peter hadn't been alone in his final hours at sea. For investigators, it was a complication. Without coordinates, they couldn't cross-reference radar data or shipping logs from that day. The phrase, "shadowing my course," could mean anything from a benign coincidence to the kind of encounter fishermen sometimes spoke about only in private: unmarked boats appearing in open water, keeping pace without explanation. If there had been such a vessel, no one would have reported it then, and no one would have come forward now. The man who had been found at the helm of the Marguerite was confronted with the logbook entry during his second round of questioning. At first, he stared at the page as though he hadn't read it, then quietly muttered, "It wasn't my choice to come here." The statement hung in the air, frustratingly ambiguous. Did he mean coming to Greystone Bay, taking the boat at all? Or was he speaking about something that had happened years earlier, perhaps even tied to the day Peter disappeared? Investigators pressed for clarification, but he shut down, his answers growing shorter until the interview was halted. Security around the man had been tight. He was being held in a temporary detention facility just outside the town while his identity was verified and background checks were conducted. He had no formal charges against him yet, but the nature of the investigation made him a person of interest. On the evening of his third night there, staff conducted routine checks at 8 p.m. and again at 10 p.m. By 11:15, during a shift change, his cell was found empty. The locks were intact, the cameras in the hallway showed no movement, and no alarms had been triggered. His personal belongings, a small canvas bag containing clothing, a folding knife, and a handful of coins in various currencies, were still in the property room. On top of these items sat something no one remembered seeing before, a small, rusted key on a simple brass ring. The key was unmarked and worn, its teeth corroded in places but still sharp at the edges. It didn't match any known lock from the Marguerite, nor any from the facility. It wasn't a standard house key, nor one from a common padlock. Forensics suggested it had been exposed to salt water for years before coming into their possession. Some investigators believed the man had been carrying it all along, hidden somewhere on his person until the moment he chose to leave it behind. Others saw it as a message, a deliberate clue, or perhaps a warning left in place of the answers he'd refused to give. His disappearance sparked immediate searches. Roadblocks were set up on the highways leading out of Greystone Bay, and the Coast Guard deployed patrols to nearby marinas in case he attempted to leave by water. But no trace of him was found. It was as if he'd stepped out of the facility and into the same void the Marguerite had emerged from. No fingerprints were left behind in his cell, no footprints in the corridors, no signs of forced entry or collusion from staff. The missing man's abrupt vanishing shifted the investigation yet again. If he had simply been a drifter who stumbled upon the boat, why go to such lengths to disappear? And if the key had meaning, what lock did it open, and where was it now? The unanswered questions mounted quickly, each one pointing back to Peter's final logbook entry, to that unnamed vessel trailing him in the hours before his radio went silent. The return of the Marguerite had given the Callaways a piece of their past back, but in its wake, it had also taken something new, the possibility that the truth, even if it still existed, might never willingly come to shore. And somewhere, far from Greystone Bay, the man who had last been seen at her wheel was still out there, carrying the rest of the story with him. 6 months after the day the Marguerite slid back into Greystone Bay, the novelty of her return had worn away. For a time, she'd been treated almost like a living relic, guarded by the Coast Guard, visited by curious locals, studied by forensic teams hoping to pull one more secret from her hull. But as the weeks passed without a breakthrough, the attention waned. The unanswered questions didn't fade, but they began to take on a more familiar shape, the kind people learned to live with in a town where the sea sometimes claimed its own and never gave anything back. Eventually, she became just another impounded vessel, her place in the shipyard less a symbol of mystery and more an unpaid bill. By late February, the official storage fees owed on the trawler had exceeded what the Coast Guard and the harbor were willing to absorb. The boat had been evidence in an active investigation, but with no suspect in custody, no confirmed crime, and no clear ownership, Peter Calloway still legally missing, presumed dead, the law treated her as abandoned property. In early March, a small notice appeared in the classifieds of the regional paper. Public auction, seized and unclaimed marine vessels, lot Tamenir 4728, fiberglass fishing trawler, formerly registered as the Marguerite, sold as is. The description was bare, the history unmentioned. Anyone outside Greystone Bay would have no reason to know that lot number 47 had once been the center of a story that had gripped an entire coastline. Marie never saw the notice in the paper, but she heard about it the way most things travel in small towns, in the awkward pause before someone decides whether to tell her. She said nothing in response. By then, she had learned that commenting, even with a simple acknowledgement, opened the door to conversations she no longer wanted to have. She refused to attend the auction. Watching strangers inspect the deck where her husband's boots had once stood, or the wheel he'd guided out past the harbor mouth, would feel like a final, public serving. Jacob didn't go either, though he considered it. Part of him wanted to see who would take her, whether they would even know her name. But another part knew that once she left the yard, she would be gone in a different way, no longer a ghost of the sea, but simply a working boat under someone else's flag. The auction drew only a modest crowd, mostly small-scale fishermen, salvage operators, and a few out-of-town buyers looking for cheap hulls to retrofit. When lot number 47 came up, the bidding was brief. She was seaworthy enough, but her history, even if unspoken, hung in the air like salt mist. The winning bid came from a man representing a marine supply company based 3 towns away. Within weeks, the trawler's hull was sandblasted, repainted in fresh white, her name scrubbed from the stern. Her registration was transferred, her engine serviced again, and her interior stripped of anything that tied her to Peter Calloway. By mid-April, she was back in the water under a new name, docked in a harbor where no one cared about her past. Officially, nothing had changed. The Coast Guard's file on Peter remained open but inactive, the status line reading, "Missing, presumed, deceased." The final report concluded there was insufficient evidence to determine the cause of his disappearance. The man found at the helm of the trawler was still listed as a person of interest, though his identity, if the authorities had ever truly learned it, was never released to the public. His escape from the detention facility was described in internal memos as unresolved, a bureaucratic understatement for an incident that had embarrassed every agency involved. The small rusted key he left behind remained in an evidence locker, tagged but unexplained, a fragment of a story no one could finish telling. Unofficially, the story refused to die. At the docks, in back rooms of bars, and on late-night calls between old fishermen, theories persisted. Some said the man had been part of whatever had happened to Peter and that returning the boat was his way of settling a debt. Others believed the Marguerite had been delivered back to Greystone Bay as a warning, the kind of message only the intended recipient would understand. The more superstitious spoke about her like a harbinger, that she had been sent back to mark an ending, or worse, to signal the beginning of something yet to come. For Marie, the whispers were noise she had no energy to address. She had already buried her husband once in her mind. She could not live in a place where every sight of a white and blue hull might pull the wound open again. She stayed inland, avoiding the coast, except for the occasional visit to Jacob, who still kept his apartment above the bait shop. He no longer walked the pier each morning as he once had, but he admitted he still caught himself scanning the horizon, almost unconsciously whenever he was near the water. He said it wasn't hope anymore, just habit, though neither of them truly believed that. The last time Jacob saw the Marguerite, or what was left of her identity, was by accident. He was driving along the coast one early summer afternoon when he spotted a small trawler coming into a neighboring harbor. The paint was clean, the name on her stern different, but the curve of the bow, the shape of the wheelhouse windows, they were unmistakable. For a long moment, he slowed the car and watched as she disappeared behind a jetty. It was like seeing a face you knew by heart, now altered enough that only you could recognize it. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. The sight alone was enough to remind him that the sea never really gives anything back. It just changes it until you can't decide whether you found it again or lost it for good. Somewhere beyond the edges of the charted fishing lanes, beyond the routes that appear on GPS screens and Coast Guard patrol logs, there is water that holds the rest of the story. Whether Peter Calloway's fate lies there, in some forgotten cove or unmarked grave of the ocean, no one in Greystone Bay can say. And maybe that's why the boat's return will never feel accidental, because things that vanish at sea tend to stay vanished, unless someone, somewhere, decides it's time for them to come back. And when they do, it's rarely to give you peace. It's to remind you that the truth is still out there, drifting in waters no one dares to chart.